and welcome everyone. My name is Ivana and I am the Programs Director at Global School Leaders, joining you all from Buenos Aires, Argentina. We are very excited to welcome you to our first ever School Leadership Matters Summit. Before we begin, here are a few guidelines to ensure the session runs smoothly. Please select the interpretation option at the bottom of the screen and choose your preferred language to follow the discussion seamlessly. The session is available in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French. The masterclass will last 60 minutes. Please use the Q&A feature to ask questions and engage with other attendees or share insights. As attendees, you will remain on mute throughout the session to avoid background noise. A gentle reminder to keep comments and questions respectful in the Q&A section, ensuring a positive and productive environment. Now that we have that out of the way, hello, hola, hola, bonjour, and welcome to all. We are thrilled to have educators from over 120 countries joining us today, including school leaders, teachers, education officers, policymakers, researchers, donors, and many more. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. Today, we are joined by one of the leading voices when it comes to school leadership. Dr. Beatriz Pont is a renowned expert in global education policy and reform, equity, and school leadership. Formerly with the OECD and now with the UNESCO IIEP as a global training practice lead, she plays an instrumental role in shaping the Institute's global training to respond to the new realities and needs of education systems worldwide. We are so grateful to have Beatriz here to take us through a masterclass on exploring strategies for designing and implementing policies that support sustainable, high-impact leadership training. Thank you, Beatriz, for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ivana. Can you hear me well?
Perfectly.
Great. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining me for this masterclass today. It is a pleasure to have you with us. I'm going to be showing you a PowerPoint, and I want to again start by presenting to you what we're going to do throughout this masterclass. So first, the focus is going to be on how to design for lasting impact, a look into school leadership development. I'm going to introduce the masterclass objectives. Then I will review why is school leadership development important for present and the future of schooling. Then we will look into what do we know and what do we see. And then we will end with a section on what can be done. What are the different options? And I'm going to invite you to intervene throughout the class. Now, the overall objectives of the class are, first, to understand why school leadership professional development is important for our future. Second objective is to identify what is the current situation and the practices in school leadership development. And third, we will want to recognize the policy approaches to develop school leadership. So let's start. Why? Why does school leadership development matters? Overall, and this is based on the data from the new GEM report, which allows us to compare globally in a number of practices, we see that school enrollments and completion have increased between 2015 to 2023 across the world. We see primary education completion rates, they've moved up across the world. They reach more than 80 to 90%, and they've increased as well in the yellow color. Low-income countries as well, primary education completion rates are now at 60%. In lower middle income countries, upper middle income and high income countries, they reach up to 100%. So we're progressing. This is also the case for lower secondary schools. Completion rates have increased across the world as well. And this has been the case for low income countries, lower middle income, upper middle income, and in high income countries, less so because they're already at high levels. And this is the same case for upper secondary education, which is quite important actually, because normally this is the level where it's not mandatory, but skills are key to contribute to our future. So we see that in countries, while in low income countries, this is still very low, it's increased a bit. Lower middle income countries, it's increased. And so has it done in upper middle income and high income countries. Now, this is important for school leadership development, and I will review why in the next slides. Now, what has happened at the same time? Actually, education expenditure has decreased from 2015 to 2023. We see that across the world, it's up to 13% of public expenditure in education is devoted to education. That's a big part of education, of world government budgets, actually, but it has decreased slightly in all countries, low income, middle income, lower. Only in lower middle income has it increased a little bit, but overall, there's been a trend towards decreasing. Now, the good news is low income countries do have a higher proportion of expenditure in education. And also another notice that is important that this GEM report shows is that not only has education expenditure decreased, but learning proficiency remains stagnant. And this can be seen from data in primary education, where we see that minimum proficiency in literacy and maths across the world has really not increased in the past 8 years. And there is a difficulty in gathering all this data, but with the data that is available, it does show that while there is more enrollments, more completion, that learning proficiency is not improving. And we also see that an external context is becoming more and more complex. We see, on the one hand, technology, pervasive technology across the world. We see the number of upper secondary schools with access to internet for pedagogical purposes. It's increased across the world. But we also see many global risks that we are faced with. And on the right, you can see a survey that shows the responses of leaders, global leaders, that show what are the global risks that they consider will become a global threat in the next 2 to 5 years. The first, for more than 1/3 of participants, is climate action failure and extreme weather, so environmental issues, but also social cohesion, livelihood crisis, human environmental damage, geoeconomic confrontations. All of these have impact on education, all of them, almost all of them. So it's quite important that we are facing a world of complexity, of uncertainty, of risks, and all of this influences schools and school leadership. Now, another contextual factor that is key is the policy environment. And we see on the left the number of reforms that have been approved or passed by countries since 1970 until 2020. And actually, while we started globally, this is in more than 190 countries, more than 600 reforms in a period of 5 years. In between 2005 and 2010, across the world, there were more than 1,700 reforms in 5 years. And while this has decreased in recent years, it's still above 1,000 reforms, 1,200 reforms per year. All of these education reforms have an impact on schools, on the role of school leaders, on teachers, on students, and on policymakers, many of you who are participating in the class today. So on top of this, there is reforms. All of these reforms have an impact on school leaders because there is a way of thinking about policy making that has been very linear. So policymakers used to consider, okay, let's define a problem, a policy, let's set the agenda, let's define the policy options, let's develop the policy, implement it, and then evaluate it. But that's just a beautiful theoretical approach to policymaking. And the right-hand side, you see actually the complexity of policy reforms, of education policy reforms, where we have politics intervening, changing governance intervening, socioeconomic trends intervening, lack of resources, other reforms that appear, different priorities from different people involved in reforms, not enough capacity. So there's so many challenges and constraints to the beautiful linear configuration of policy reforms to actually what really happens on the ground in schools. And all of this is quite important. So overall, all of this changing context matters for school leadership development. We see environmental issues, the impact in terms of the infrastructure, teaching and learning. The technology have a huge influence on schools and education because of a constant change, because we need to be experts in technology now, because we need to integrate it into pedagogy, into teaching and learning. Diversity as well is a huge issue globally that requires to be covered in schools and classrooms. And that means that we have to have different ways of pedagogy, different school and classroom practices, and different ways of looking at education. In terms of student learning, we've moved from a focus on solely on knowledge to a focus also on knowledge and skills and competencies. And this requires considering reviewing the curricula, considering pedagogy and different ways of learning. Governance has also changed. We've moved, as I said before, from this linear configuration from which was very top-down to a complex world with many stakeholders involved. And we've also moved from reforms to looking at results. And so that means a stronger focus on implementation. And we've also increased the focus on accountability, moving away from only quantity to actually having impact. And that requires a stronger use of evidence and data. So when you look on the right, we see that all of these changing contextual factors have an impact on education and a direct impact on school leadership. You think, okay, the environment, infrastructure, teaching and learning, school leaders need to adapt their schools. They need to be ready. They need to understand what's going to happen. They need to close schools. They need to open them. They need to understand how the environment will affect schools and be very preventive. In terms of technology, they need to integrate new technologies, new softwares, new hardwares, new approaches to teaching and learning into schools and even configure schools overall differently. In terms of diversity, they need to think about the pedagogy, the school and classroom allocations, the student coverage, how to take care of the diversity of students across the school. In terms of student learning, they need to introduce curricula. They need to know what is the appropriate curricula for their schools. In terms of governance, new stakeholder engagement, they need to be involved in reforms, and they also are at the end or at the center of implementation. So they're involved. And then in terms of the use of evidence and data, they need to produce data, they need to understand and use data, and they need to be ready. So all of these external factors are really influence the practice of school leadership and school leadership development. So now I'm going to stop here because we wanted to check with you how you think context affects school leadership. So I will invite Paula to share a first poll that we have for you. And the main question we want you to respond to is, what contextual changes do you anticipate can influence your school leadership practices in your country over the next 5 years? You can click, it's a multiple choice, so please go ahead and click.
Sí.
I'm going to give you a couple of minutes and then we will see the results of the poll. Okay. Paula, are we ready to close the poll? Do we have? Okay, very interesting. I see. I think all of you can see the poll. Technology, number one, competency-based curricula, reform implementation. The environment less, diversity, then the environment, then complex governance and accountability. So at the top is technology, which is something we're all grappling with at present, and I think it's key for schools. And do principals, do school leaders, do education policymakers have the knowledge to be able to use technology in the way that is necessary for student learning and for reconfiguring their schools? And that's a key. That's 72% of you chose this. Then competency-based curricula. I'm aware that many countries globally are now in the process of moving away from a purely knowledge-based curricula to a knowledge and competency-based curricula. So more than half of you selected this. The next is reform implementation. That's something that I work on quite in depth, and that's more and more a key priority of many people, knowing that there's been so much investment in policies, but that the results are not coming through. And therefore, a focus on implementation is becoming a priority. And that involves school leaders as well, because they are the ones at the end of all these marvelously written policy documents that we prepare at different levels of the system, and that school leaders have to implement. If they don't implement, no reform will happen. So it's key. Okay, so I'm going to now close the poll and continue. So thank you for responding. And we move now, after we've seen these global trends and what is happening globally that influences the practice of school leaderships. Are actually school leaders, are they ready to face these trends? What would you think? We're going to look at this. Actually, there are huge, high expectations for school leaders. We know that the evidence has shown that after teachers, school leadership or the role of school leaders is key and most important in school improvement. And this is at different levels of the system. At the classroom level and at the school level, school leaders develop the conditions and the environment for teachers to teach well and students to learn well. It's very simple, put it in this way, but it's a very complex task because it's not direct, it's really indirect. But you know when there is a bad school leader or a leadership that is missing, and it's very noticeable, but when there's high quality school leadership, it also schools flow and the conditions are there for effective teaching and learning. But they also, school leaders work with the community, and that's a key role that they have at the local level. Further, they work with the system, as I said, with policy reforms. They do sense making of the context that surrounds them. So all of these contextual factors, they are the ones who interpret what is happening outside and make sense of it for the school. And they implement policies in practice. So there are very high expectations for school leaders. They're supposed to improve learning for all students, work with teachers, work with parents, work with the community, work with policymakers. They also need to know how to do financial management, human resource management, use data, and there are very high expectations for them. But are they ready? Are school leaders ready for the expectations that we have set for them when we're requesting schools to prepare and train and make sure that all our students are learning? Well, when we look at the data, we see that the academic background of school leaders is quite high. Here, when you see in yellow, ISCED 6 is a university level education. So in most countries, at least they have a university level education. In green is a master's level education, and in blue is a PhD. So most school leaders do have this level of education. In some countries, it's still missing. There's a few principals who have below ISCED 5 when they enter the profession, but overall, they are well trained. And this is often because they are teachers who become school leaders. And so they already have a teacher, initial teacher education or initial university degree in order to teach. Now, what do we see in terms of the types of school leadership training? We see here a question on the percentage of lower secondary school principals who have done a program by the time that they've done this program. And that means whether they've done it before taking up the position as a principal or a school leader, before and after taking up the position, or after taking the position, or never. Never in green. We see that never there is in some countries. For example, Lithuania, it's up to 40% who've never taken any, or in Croatia, it's 60% who have never done any training. And in a number of countries, this is, it's non-negligible. Most of the countries have done training rather after taking the position as a principal, but very limited amount of principals have been prepared before taking up the position of a principal. And actually, just imagine yourself, many of you may be principals, but when you join, you start, you're a teacher and you become a school principal and have to take on these very difficult tasks with very high expectations and without any training. You've not been given the skills to be able to take on the position as you really need to do. So it must be very, very challenging to be able to do that. And so often what happens is that countries have training after starting the position. And that's the induction that doesn't really happen, but it's more professional development in later stages. So, we're playing our systems short because we have high expectations. We want our schools to do the best, but we don't give the skills that are required to those who are leading schools at the time when they need them the most, which is they enter into this profession. We also see from the GEM report, which actually has marvelous data. It's the first time I've seen this key data comparing global practices on school leadership. And here we see in the left the proportion of countries with school leadership training legislation or policies in terms of training. And that is induction, which is, we have first pre-service, which is before starting practice, then induction, which is right immediately after practice, then in service. And when we see the proportions, we see that it's actually in service, again, the highest proportion of training. Pre-service is also high, or at least in a number of countries, it's at least 50. And in Asia, it's up to 80% actually. And Northern Africa and Western Asia as well, it's very high. In some other countries, the investment is lower. And that is it is a financial challenge because who pays for that pre-service training? That's a big issue. Is it individuals or is it the government? Is it the ministry? Who pays for the preparation of somebody who will become a school leader? It's not very clear, actually. So this is why it's easier as a policy to invest in service once they are in the position. And then induction is limited between 10 and 40% across countries. Now, what do we want to know? Are these training programs effective? Do they tackle the key knowledge and skills that are required for effective leadership practice? And then are they updated constantly to take into account this increasingly complex and uncertain, challenging world that is facing schools? That's key. And we don't know about the content. That's very, very difficult to know, actually. So what type of skills should they be trained for? The report comes up with these key dimensions for effective school leadership practice, and they're based on Leetwood's seminal work. And these key dimensions are school principals, school leaders, school leadership. They need to set the vision, set the expectations together with others for the school direction. Where are we heading? Where should this school move towards in the future? And then they need to focus on learning. That's pedagogical or instructional leadership. What is our learning agenda? Where are we moving towards? What do we want to aim for in the next year, in the next 2 years? And how am I going to work with my school body, with the teachers, with the students, with the parents, to enhance the focus on learning? Third is to foster collaboration. Most of the evidence now shows that collaboration across teachers and across school bodies is what makes a huge difference in improving learning outcomes. And the fourth is developing people, that is working with teachers and others to make sure that they are constantly learning. And these are the key dimensions for effective school leadership practice. And how can these be taught, actually? What's important is to consider the coherence with the practice and to have standards, which we've seen many countries do have now, to have a strong focus on instructional leadership, which in the past was not the case. School principals or leadership was really less of leadership and really more of management of the day-to-day work, but not so much the focus on learning. And now this is, has changed quite a lot to really focus on the core business of schools, which is student learning. They are the clients. They are those who need to be at the center of all the actions that are done in schools. And they need to have leadership skills and competencies. And these are very difficult to develop in. And they need to, have practice. They need to have exercises. They need to work with others. There's a number of leadership skills that are very soft skills that need to be developed and need to be taught, actually. And they need to be practice-based and very much contextualized, as I was saying from the beginning. What is happening outside of the school, they need to really be integrated into the training. So here we see the detail of these practices and skills required. These are very detailed. I'm just going to touch upon them because I think they're quite important and it's at the core of what we are looking at today. They set expectations, and that is to develop and communicate and explain a shared vision of the school, the mission, the goals of the school. Where are we heading towards? Imagine if this is not there, how do teachers know? How do parents know? How do students know? What is the aim and where they need to move forward with? They need to hold high performance expectations for everyone, for staff and for students. And that is something that is quite vital, actually. When that doesn't happen, schools don't perform. And they need to provide motivation to others and represent the community and stay current and use data for decision making. Then they need to focus on learning, instructional development, pedagogy. That's a key focus. They need to be supervising that learning is happening across their school. And that means making sure that this happens with all teachers. And they need to provide instructional resources and align them to the goals, then plan and coordinate and evaluate the curriculum, protect staff from distractions, monitor student progress. The third key aspect is to foster collaboration, and that is to develop a school culture that has a positive climate, to maintain a safe, healthy school environment, and that is becoming a key issue globally in terms of the environment, but also in terms of health and mental health and well-being. They also need to raise resources strategically and build networks and manage risks. They need to nurture collaboration between teachers and enable actions that encourage collaboration and build relations with families and with the community, especially in the more disadvantaged schools. Then they need to develop people. That is keeping track of teacher professional development needs, provide professional support and mentoring opportunities for their teachers, evaluate teachers, reward good performance, provide intellectual stimulation, establish trusting relationships, managing conflict, and being there for the teaching workforce. So these are key school leadership practices. And so what type of skills do we need and which ones can we best prepare? So now we're going to have another poll for you on these practices. And so I invite Paula to share the poll. And this is from your perspective. Out of these practices, which are the more important for school leadership to set expectations? You can choose. So we're going to go through these four, and you can choose one or two, I think, rather than all of them. So prioritize two per question. So from your perspective, what practices are more important for school leadership to set expectations, to focus on learning, to foster collaboration, and to develop people? So I will stop here and wait for you to consider these, because these are key. And this is not only for the poll, but because this is a masterclass, it's for you to remember as well. Paula, how is the poll going? I will let you select when you think it's ready to be closed, because it takes a little bit to read the text and select. So I'll give 1 more minute and then we close. Okay, do you want to share the results with us? This is the global masterclass, so we have very different perspectives across the world. So in terms of setting expectations, the first by far is to develop and communicate and explain a shared vision, mission, and goals of the school. Second, in terms of the focus on learning, we see also that 2/3 have voted focus on instructional development, such as pedagogical supervision. In the past, this would not have been the case. I did a study of school leadership in 2008 and compared 22 education systems across the world. And the fact was that many school leaders did not even open the door of classrooms. They didn't do walk around to see what was happening in the classrooms. And that was something that has changed in the past 20 years, I think, for the better, to make sure that school leaders do focus on instructional development. And here we see it prioritized. Then we see again here 57 to foster collaboration, to one priority to nurture collaboration between teachers and enable action. This is often difficult, I think, especially in secondary schools where each teacher arrives to their own subject and but it's quite key, I think, as a priority for leadership, and then to develop a school culture and positive climate. So more than half of you have voted for these two, which are really key to make sure that the school is working well and doing the best for its students. And in terms of developing people, it's to provide professional support and mentoring opportunities for teachers, the winner, by 84%. So it's quite high. We see that it's really about teachers and supporting teachers to do the best that they can do in their practice. Thank you very much for completing this. We're going to now move then to see. So based on your response, I wanted to come back and see actually what have global education systems responded to in terms of their training. And here we see, are they ready? Are school leaders ready? Well, the percentage of school principal preparation and training programs are in terms of pre-service or in-service, are they focusing on which of these areas? And actually, we see that only in service, 21% of those focus on all of these four key dimensions of school leadership practice. It's actually the highest proportion is for focus on learning. Then second, they talking about setting a vision. The third is developing staff. And the fourth is fostering collaboration. In terms of pre-service, it's actually the focus on learning and setting the vision. So it's the priority is always the focus on learning at the beginning. And it may be that it's also because a number of these are also about teachers. They're for teachers as well. So you can see, are they these specific training programs for school leaders? What are they focusing on? But it's important to see that setting the vision has become a priority as well, with in-service more than 50% of the education systems are having this as a priority in their training programs. So the issues, are these training programs effective? Do they tackle the key knowledge and skills needed for leadership practice? And are they updated to take into account the increasingly complex and challenging world that schools are facing now and are going to face in the future? And I think as you consider in the future, whether you're a school leader, whether you are a policymaker, an administrator, this is key when you think about school leadership development. Now, the reality is that can we consider professionalizing school leadership? These are the different points that we would need to consider. So when looking at the reality, teachers, normally school leaders are teachers, they have a teaching background, and we've seen that they often don't have leadership training. So less than half have leadership training before starting the position. So they go on to selection and recruitment, and the selection processes, the evidence based on the GEM report analysis shows that the selection processes are they're becoming competitive. They're introducing selection criteria that include that they need to be trained or need to have some kind of skills to be school leaders. Sometimes they're political selections or based on other criteria, but these need to be professional and they're slowly becoming more competitive. In terms of induction, which is quite key to entering the profession, especially if there's no initial leadership training, we've seen that it's limited, but we know the evidence shows that it's quite effective. In terms of continuous professional development, that's essential, especially in the absence of pre-service training, and needs to be very practice-based. And we've seen that it's been prioritized as a policy approach globally. And finally, while this is not about school leadership training per se, the development of school leadership as a profession is quite important overall. And so it's important to have the right incentives, to have evaluation and appraisals and opportunities to have a career development that embraces this perspective of school leaders. And the GEM report also reviews this and shows quite a set of variable practices across the world. But I would recommend that you read the report to see what is happening as well. So are we there? Are we in the path towards professionalizing school leadership? Well, we're going to look at this now. What are the policy approaches to develop school leadership? We see, again, going back to what we've been reviewing, there are very high expectations. And actually, when we look at the picture that we've seen in terms of professional development, it seems to be a low investment. It doesn't look like it matches the expectations that are put on principals. And when we look at the global education reforms, there is a database called the World Education Reform Database that has analyzed the different reforms undertaken since 1970 to 2018. And they review that most policies really have focused at the core of education. The topics related to curriculum, to teaching remain stable and highly prevalent over time. They also focus on more and more towards access and inclusion. Reforms on equity, on access, inclusion continue to grow. And they also show that there's been a shift in the policy approaches towards change from traditional management, moving away from traditional management and organization reforms, very much towards data and information systems. So in the most recent policy making trends, it's really about data and having more information to be able to make decisions. Now, what has happened in terms of school leadership policies? Actually, when looking at this as part of these global education reforms, and I also did this as part of my work and my thesis and other work that I've done, we've seen that it has not been a policy priority. What's happened is that school leaders are invested in when other reforms centered around curriculum, accountability, autonomy, when they are created, then they know that somebody needs to implement these. So they invest in training for school leaders. But it's not a policy it has not been a direct policy priority. School leadership policies have focused much more on training programs, as we've seen, but often these are limited in time. So they're short courses that are there. Some countries have I mean, this is really, you can't see a global trend, but overall, it doesn't show that there is a coherent approach to school leadership policy making. There's been advances in the definition of standards, in selection, but all of these are often not coherent. And also we see that there is a tension in the role in terms of what is expected of school leaders and what they need to be doing. They need to be leading schools towards education improvement, but they're also asked all the time to be agents of other reforms that the government is implementing. So there really is a tension that they are there playing that is quite complex. So not a policy priority. Policies are not coherent and a difficult role. So not fully matching the high priority that they need to be in terms of the investment. So I'm going to have a last poll now, which is about school leadership professional development. And the question is, if you had to implement a school leadership development strategy, which would you prioritize? And please choose just one, whether it would be pre-service training, induction, continuous professional development, or having a career perspective covering all the three. Okay, Paula, do you think the voting is ready? Okay, thank you very much. So we see here a competition between a career perspective covering the three and continuous professional development, but no investment in pre-service training, very limited, and very limited in induction. So which one, I guess the question is which one gives you more for the investment that you make? If you are a policymaker and you have a limited resources, limited amount of money, where do you put it? What will give you the most traction? And so here it's either a career covering the three, or if you have to focus on one, it would be continuous professional development. Thank you very much. So we're going to continue actually. When we see what's done by countries, where they invest, as you've responded, it's in service, more than 80, 90% have legislation for in-service training, but less for pre-service and even less for induction. And so I want to recap again what is important of all this training is actually to invest in training that develops core school leadership skills to set expectations, to focus on learning, to foster collaboration, and to develop people in all of these types of training. And I want to now come back to the figure that I showed before, actually, which is key, of considering the school leadership profession as a profession, actually, professionalizing the practice, and not only so having a coherent approach, not only thinking about training as the solution, but actually considering it as a profession. And that means considering the initial skills they have when they enter, because they're going to enter, if they enter without skills for being able to lead teams, to set a vision. I mean, teachers, the practice that they do is teach students in classrooms. So you're going to expect them, if they're not trained, to be able to know how to set a vision, how to work with others, how to do a lot of tasks that they have not been prepared for. So initial leadership training is important, whether short courses to introduce key leadership dimensions. Some countries have university studies, others have certification approaches, but this exists in many countries. Whether this is a requirement or not in selection and recruitment, this is something that is to be considered, I think, to have initial leadership skills as part of professional recruitment practices. Induction, we know that is very difficult to organize, and that school leaders that join to lead a school from the beginning, they highly value having mentors, having coaches, having networks of practitioners that allow them to share their practice, to learn. And so it is an investment that is worthwhile. And then continuous professional development with peers and always related to actual practices. And actually, this can be on specific topics such as, tackling environmental challenges for your school, or technology, or to update on different challenges, or more generally to have leadership skills. And then number 5, not to forget that there are a wider set of practices that are important for school leaders to feel that they have a profession that they invest in, and that is incentives and wages, to have a evaluation and appraisal of their practice that helps them improve, and to have career development opportunities that they can move forward in the future, and that they don't feel that they are stuck. So, for example, some countries, a teacher becomes a principal, and then 4 years later, they have to go back to being a teacher. So they have not very high incentives to really change their practices for 4 years if they're going to be back to being teachers. So overall, to consider the development of school leadership as professionals, and consider all of this as a profession that brings in together the different dimensions. But not to forget that beyond school leadership practice, the context is hugely important, and it needs to be integrated. All these challenges, they need to be aware, they need to be able to respond, because we put the children, they are their responsibility. So climate action, climate extreme weather conditions, the school leaders have to respond right away. So they need to be prepared. They need to be prepared to respond to social cohesion issues, inequalities, and a number of of issues that they need to tackle. So it's quite important to integrate that into their training and development. And furthermore, as we've seen that policymaking has changed quite a lot and that there's a wide range of system leadership that the report, the GEM report also reviews, which is really interesting. And it looks into the role of ministers who, they come in, they pass a law, and 2 years later they're out. And so who's left to implement these changes and these reforms? So there's this large ecosystem of ministries, regional bodies, local level institution, development partners, NGOs, civil society organizations, a number that are around schools and school leaders and classroom practices that need to be considered, because if they don't collaborate well and understand what is happening at the school level, it's very difficult that school leaders will be able to do their job well. So developing system leadership capacity is quite key as well. So these are the two factors that go beyond the borders of a school that need to be taken into consideration. So this is the end of the masterclass, and I wanted to present to you the key takeaways. The first is we've reviewed, that school leadership professional development is important, is very important for the future of our education systems. Number two, that the current policy approaches, they are moving in the right direction to develop school leadership, but they're still piecemeal and they need to consider both content and context. And number three, that there are coherent policy approaches to develop and especially to invest, to consider it an investment in developing a school leadership profession that can enhance student learning. And so I've now reached the end of the masterclass, and I wanted to see if there's any questions before we reach the end of the masterclass. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beatriz. I'm sure everyone is delighted with the masterclass. To me, it's been a privilege. We've learned a lot. Indeed, there are some questions, Beatriz, I guess that we can ask like one per time. There is one that is asking about the evidence on the effectiveness of school leadership on professional development in student learning. We have carried out an evidence review on that, but maybe you can share some information based on your experience, Beatriz.
Thank you. It's quite an important question, because there's, we're asking to invest in school leadership professional development and the evidence. There's different evidence. I think one of the persons who's done a lot of studies on this is Linda Darling-Hammond, especially in the US. And they show, and then there's Richard Elmore and many others. They show that actually the training that is most effective is the one that is related to the practice, that the one that is, first of all, what I've been insisting in is that the focus needs to be on what they need to be practicing in the classroom. And so from theory to practice, it's quite important that they have the basic knowledge, but that they have they're able to try out the different practices that they will be using in school. So focusing it very much on the real practice. And often what happens with universities is that they're very theoretical. And so when school leaders arrive into schools, it's very difficult to put into practice what they learn, because they need to have very practical skills that are very much focused on leadership, who they are as leaders, how they can convince people, how can they engage people, how can they, and then what tools do they have available in order to be able to do that. So they need to have these two dimensions. And so probably the evidence has showed that the most effective one, because it's easier to measure, is continuous professional development, because it's more direct. And the effects of professional development are very indirect. And I can say that as well, because we at the IIEP, we train we we train policymakers, education policymakers to be able to do policy and planning. And so we always measure the training at the end. We have a number of surveys, but if you want to measure, you need to go back and see what they've been doing for the next year, for the following year. And it's very expensive and it takes a long time. And what we see is that most of the people who follow our training, they say that they're going to be using what we taught them right away, that it's going to change their practice because they have practical tools in order to be able to do this. And I think that's key for school leaders as well. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. There is another question related to the role of school leaders. There is also a lot of research about that, but I guess it's going to be very interesting to know your perspective, Beatriz, about, do you think that is it really possible for school leaders to be both managers and instructional leaders?
Yes, well, I mean, there is an issue. The tension between management and leadership is always there in many roles and in schools as well, because you get lost in the urgent versus the important. And that is, setting the vision, and having the vision and the capacity to work with teachers to develop the school plan and the curriculum, and then to make sure that teachers are learning, that they're collaborating with each other. And then you get caught in paperwork, which is what most school leader surveys say, that there's a lot of administration that gets thrown at them. And so they receive, fill out this survey, fill out this data, fill this out. So there's a lot of administrative tasks that they need to do. Some of them are important, some of them less. So I've seen that in surveys where principals have 56-hour work weeks, 60-hour work weeks. Some countries have decided to reduce the administrative load that they have for principals, or delegate this to others so that they can really concentrate on what is more important for student learning. And so it is always a constant tension. And I think what happens is that leaders that are trained, they are able to see that difference. And they can say, okay, this is management. I'll take care of it 1/3 of my time, but I'm going to leave time to be able to do instructional leadership, because that's what I'm going to be rated on. And that's why I'm here, actually, because I want my school to do the best as possible. So when they are aware of this, they've received training, they understand this, they can then focus on this much more. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatriz. It deserves a lot of discussion. I'm sure we all have a lot of questions, but unfortunately there is no time. Your presentation has been stunning. All of you can watch it later in YouTube. Thank you, Beatriz, for being here with us, and thank you to everyone else for being a wonderful audience. And please be sure to share your thoughts on social media, tagging our event, and you can also find more information on our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.